I'm trying to get rid of. All right. Those of you online, we've joined you now. We've just been waiting for everyone to get together. Um, we're, of course, how did the Sabbath change is the part of church history that we're looking at right now. Just want to go through one of these again. This is just review. We've been through this as a third time now. Jesus changed the Sabbath from the way the Pharisees, religious lawyers thought of it. So that had an impact, of course, how later people would think, is they juggled. What's the Sabbath all about now? Because Jesus took whatever the Pharisees did and threw it in the garbage and said, okay, now we're going to do it differently. So they had to deal with that. They had to relate to that. How do you make that transition? And of course, the Jewish people had to make a huge transition. Can you imagine being a Jew in the day of Jesus and becoming a Christian? And then you look at all the things that Jesus did and taught about the Sabbath, and you said, man, how do I relate to that? I've done it differently all my life. How do I now change my way of looking at the Sabbath? And of course, that's obviously what Jesus wanted them to do. Paul taught that we were saved by grace and not the law. That also was a huge issue for the Jewish people to wrap their minds around. And even the Apostle Paul, how did God finally get his attention? Struck him down on the road to Damascus. And then he came to that realization. By the way, and I'll say some more about that a little bit later. But the issue going back to the day of the Apostle Paul was a singular issue. What was the singular issue that we see in the life of Paul, recorded in the New Testament? What is the significant issue? No, the significant issue was, how does salvation come? Correct? How are we saved? Right. I mean, Galatians, remember the whole thing in Galatians, of course? If I or an angel from heaven teach you a different gospel than what I've delivered to you, let them be accursed. So that was the issue. When Paul was talking about the mystery of iniquity that was already at work in the church, what was he talking about? He was talking about a departure from the gospel. That is the singular issue to Paul. And when we come down to end time events, and once again I'll say more about this later on, end time events are not about the Sabbath. If the end time events are about the Sabbath, Jesus owes an apology to the Pharisees. Right? What was the issue of the Protestant Reformation? Exactly. By faith and by faith alone. Because all of Christianity had gone a different route. So it was that issue in the day of Paul. It was that issue of the Protestant Reformation. It will be that issue that will be the issue at the end of time. Always the same, consistency, all the way through history. I didn't mean to get, I really was going to do this a little later. I've kind of gotten off focus here. But when we look back at the time of the Protestant Reformation, who were the reformers standing up against? No, at the time of the Protestant Reformation, who were they standing up against? Well, the papal power, but prophetically, they were standing up what? Against the little horn of Daniel chapter 7, correct? Antichrist power, etc. What was the issue of the Antichrist power that the reformers stood up against? That we as Adventists have looked at for years in Daniel Revelation. That was the issue, correct? So why do we take the issue, and when we say that the beast has two lives, remember it receives a deadly wound and it comes back to life, why do we suddenly change the issue? It's the same issue all the way from the beginning to the end. All right. It's still an issue. Yes. All right. Number 3, There was tension in the early church between Paul and Judaizing Christians. We see it all through his writings. Paul and Jesus were misunderstood, and we've seen that in some of the things that we have shared. They were understood at a very early date, misunderstood at a very early date. We've also examined how there was the Jewish hatred for Christians, there was the Christian hatred for Jews, and there was the Roman hatred of the Jews. And all of these elements now led to a drift away from the seventh-day Sabbath. All of those things played into it. Now, those aren't the only issues, but those issues certainly played into what took place there. All right. Now, let's go back to 193 A.D., and you see there is this guy, Septimus, who was the Roman emperor. Okay? The reason I want to bring up this particular Roman emperor is because even though, as we have already seen, the issue of Sunday and a sun god had been in the Roman Empire even before the days of Jesus. But it grew in intensity as you came down to the 2nd and 3rd centuries. That the sun god became a more important god. And we went over some of that last week. But this is the guy, this is the Roman emperor that really established sun worship in the Roman Empire. All right? He's the guy that got it going. But now we come down to the next emperor. And if it's all right with you, I'm just going to call him Helio. What does Helio mean? The sun, right? Okay, this guy was the emperor of Rome. Now, this guy is the guy that finalized what his, I don't know, his great-great-grandfather or whatever, had gotten going. He really finalized and brought in and established sun worship as the official worship of the Roman Empire. Now, let me share with you a little bit about this guy, and you may find this interesting, especially in the context of today. Solomon said there's nothing new under the sun, right? Right. Well, this guy would fit in perfectly in a lot of today's environment. But he became emperor when he was by the conniving of his grandmother. He became emperor when he was 14 years old. And he ruled for 4 years until he was 18 years old. But this guy has, as far as, the people of Rome and the historians of Rome and so forth look back, this is the worst emperor that they ever had. And he is largely judged by them on the issues of morality. And this is something that may escape us. But the Romans were kind of, not that there wasn't immorality in Rome, but they had a high regard for family. I mean, stop and think about it for just a moment. If you look at the Old Testament, I mean, throughout the whole Old Testament, you have all this plural marriage and stuff, right? And you come to the New Testament, what happened? It all came to an end, right? Roman Empire didn't tolerate that. And so the only reason I'm mentioning that is the Roman Empire actually had a high regard for marriage. Now, that doesn't mean that there wasn't a lot of crazy stuff going on even with the emperors. There was. But still, there was at least this public acknowledgement. So you have an emperor now that comes along. And in the 4 years that he was emperor, he was married 5 times. And yeah. And he was married 5 times. And then one of the girls that he married was a Vestal virgin. Now, I don't know if you're aware of what the Vestal virgins were. In fact, there was a whole temple for them and everything there in Rome. It was a really important part of the culture of Rome, these Vestal virgins. And these Vestal virgins had to remain in that state throughout their lifetime. And if they did not, they were buried alive. So they were serious about these girls now that became Vestal virgins remaining that way. Well, this guy falls in love with them, this Helio, falls in love with one of them and marries her. Now, you can imagine the scandal that would have been after these hundreds of years of tradition in the Roman Empire, and he comes along and just takes one of the Vestal Virgins and marries them. However, it's thought the guy really, he was married 5 times, but it was thought that he really didn't care for women. He really favored the guys. And so he had a soldier that he was married to. He claimed, anyway, that this soldier was his husband. All right? That sounds a little familiar, doesn't it? And I told you nothing's new under the sun. And so, anyway, this guy would go into the bars at Rome. He was a cross-dresser. And he would go into the bars at Rome and present himself as a prostitute. This is Emperor of Rome doing bar hopping, cross-dress, presenting himself as a prostitute. Okay? So, in Roman society, this just didn't go down very well. And so, ultimately, his grandmother that had gotten him on the throne conspired against him and got him murdered, all right, and got him out of the way. However, he was a priest of a religion in Syria, and he brought with him now that teaching and saw a golden opportunity, because going back to Septimus, the sun god had been established to some degree. And now he had his god. He brought it in and blended it together with the sun god and established now this whole sun worship scheme in Rome, along with the temple that he built, and declared this now the official religion of Rome. And now he was the high priest of the religion of the sun. And he required, there are a lot of strange things happening to this guy. By the way, his mother and grandmother were the first women to enter the Roman Senate. And they took a picture of him, you know, an artist rendering or whatever, and put it over the god that was represented there in the Senate, so that when the senators would worship that god, they also were worshiping their emperor. But this guy would require all the senators to come and participate in this great celebration. The celebration, there was a celebration that he did at the change in the summertime, you know, on June 21st. The celebration they did then. But there's also another celebration that they did in December, remember, to the sun. And that later became Christian Christmas. And you may also remember from last week that the worship of Saturn had been shortly before that, from December 17 to December 23. And then that was taken then when Saturn was demoted and Jupiter were demoted and the sun elevated. That holiday was blended in now to the holiday to the sun, which was then ultimately blended into the Christian Christmas. All right, so this guy then would require all these senators to come, and he would lead out he would dance around, and he would do all kinds of crazy stuff. And anyway, the senators all had to come there and, you know, rah, rah, rah to Helio, and, you know, because he was the high priest of the sun. But he is the one that really established the sun worship, the worship of the sun, as the official religion of the Roman Empire. And the god was called, I put it up here on the screen, it was called the god of the undefeated sun. So that's who the Romans were worshiping, and that became now the official god of Rome. Well, Sunday then, of course, had some importance, because that we know that was the day of the sun, and the worship of the sun god was so important to them. All right. we'll come back and think about some of those things a little bit later. But let's go now to the Edict of Milan. We're going to talk about Constantine, okay? Because a lot of Adventists will, well, how did the Sabbath get changed? Well, Constantine the Pope, they pulled this thing off. Well, it's not really the case. So, the Edict of Milan. Anyone remember what that was? That was an edict given by Constantine and another emperor that was over in what we call the Balkans today. Rome wasn't totally united, so there was another emperor over there. They got together and they came up with this that gave all religions freedom in Rome. Now I want you to let that one soak in for just a minute. It's an edict of religious freedom. All right? It is an edict of religious freedom. All right? So not only were the Christians persecuted, but there were many other religious groups in Rome that were persecuted as well. And the Edict of Milan said, every religion now is respectable and every religion has the right to function within the empire. So now there was no discrimination among the religions as far as allowing them at least to practice. Obviously, there were some preferred religions, but everyone could practice. So now let me ask you this. Was that a good thing or a bad thing? Okay, why? Have you ever heard anybody stand up and say, rah, rah, Constantine, finally he stopped the persecution and gave everyone freedom as we enjoy in this country today to practice religion as God gives them the right to see it? He did. All right. So, listen. I know. Now, I'm not trying to promote the great Constantine. Don't get me wrong on this. But Constantine is not the evil character of history that he has often been presented as. He actually was a fairly decent emperor, especially compared to some like Helio. He was an outstanding emperor, and he ruled the empire well. And he did it with reason and sanity, and the empire of Rome prospered. So from the standpoint of government, he did a reasonably decent job. All right? But he also now brought to an end persecution against religion. Constantine was not an evil guy. I know sometimes he's painted like he's a devil wearing a human suit or something. Now, so he passed this edict. The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD was organized by Constantine. This was the first really great universal church council, probably. And it brought in people from all different places around the empire, all the way from Great Britain. The empire stretched out tremendously, and brought people in from all over. It's thought that there were maybe 1,800 people that were there. These were all church leaders that had been brought in for the Council of Nicaea. Well, who organized that? Constantine organized it. Now, the Roman emperors had always had control of religion in the Roman Empire. And so Constantine, while he backed away from that, where he wasn't persecuting, everybody, do what you want to do, he did want Christianity to be organized and to speak with one voice. And Christianity had a lot of different ideas and concepts. So he brought them all together and had this Council of Nicaea. And so, what they did is they tried to establish some early Christian belief there. But this was something that Constantine had organized along with two other guys, both of them named Eusebius. And we'll come to more of that in just a minute. Later on now, after the time of Constantine, we have the Council of Laodicea. And I put this one up. This is really the next great church council, the Council of Laodicea, because Laodicea did pass legislation, did at least religious legislation, about which day Christians were to keep. But notice now, this didn't happen during the time of Constantine. This happened later in the Council of Laodicea. It did not have, the council that Constantine organized, that did not happen. But it was later. Now, Constantine, of course, did have a law that he passed, and we'll look at that in a minute. This is, maybe you can see it on this screen a little bit better over here. This is Caesarea. And you remember that we spent some time, I shared with you one night, went to Israel about Caesarea. Great place. They're on the coast of northern Israel. This is the amphitheater that's there. Off in the distance, you can see the place where probably the Apostle Paul was imprisoned. This is a picture that, Boomy R1 took. So anyway, this is Caesarea. And there was a bishop there in Caesarea by the name of Eusebius. Okay, now you come up the coast a little bit and you come up to Beirut. You know, northern Israel, what's your next stop? Going up the coast is Lebanon, right? And then, their city, of course, is Beirut. And so there were two bishops. One that was in Caesarea, his name was Eusebius. There was one in Lebanon, Beirut, his name was Eusebius. All right? So, this is the Eusebius. Now, both of these men, the reason I'm mentioning them, both of these men had an impact on Constantine. Christian individuals, both of them had a close relationship with Constantine. All right, now this is Eusebius of Caesarea. Eusebius of Caesarea wrote this: "The Logos has transferred by the new alliance the celebration of the Sabbath to the rising of the light." Now, I shared with you some passages last week from the Old Testament about the sun and about light. The Gospel of John starts out how? Do you remember? In the beginning was the Word, but then right after that, what happened? The Word became flesh. And so it was the light that came into the darkness, remember? And then the darkness did not comprehend what it was. And so you have a lot of these kind of references, both Old and New Testament, about the light. So, when these guys started thinking about Sunday, what did they think about? It's the day of light, right? Because that's the day of the sun. And so they kind of combined these concepts. This is what he's doing here. The Logos has transferred by the new alliance the celebration of the Sabbath to the rising of the light. He has given us a type of the true rest in saying, in the saving day of the Lord, the first day of light. In this day of light, first day and true day of the sun, when we gather after the interval of 6 days, we celebrate the holy and spiritual Sabbaths. All right? He's a little bit scripturally confused, right? But anyway, you understand what he's saying. All things whatsoever that were prescribed for the Sabbath. This is a really intriguing statement. All things whatsoever that were prescribed for the Sabbath. Who's he talking about there? Who prescribed the things about the Sabbath? The Jews, right? Okay, well, God in the truest sense. Yeah. All things whatsoever were prescribed for the Sabbath, we have transferred them to the Lord's day. What's he saying? He changed the Sabbath, right? So we have taken, who's the we, by the way? Christians. Now, he's writing this, we're looking at around 300 AD, give or take. So this is at the time of Constantine. And so now, from a Christian perspective, he says, we have taken the things of the Sabbath, and we Christians have now put them on Sunday. That's the day of light. All things whatsoever that were prescribed for the Sabbath, we have transferred them to the Lord's Day as being more authoritative and more highly regarded and first in rank and more honorable than the Jewish Sabbath. So the Sabbath now is what? It's no longer the Sabbath of humanity, but it is the Jewish Sabbath. Once again, you see that we're moving away from Judaism. That's old, that's past. Now we're moving into a different understanding. So, almost universally, these guys ascribed the Sabbath to being Jewish. Now, scripturally, that's pretty difficult to do, isn't it? If you believe the account of creation. But they found innovative ways of doing it. And, of course, we noted one of them already that said, well, the Sabbath is valid. It's just, each day means 1,000 years. We saw that. This continuing on now. In fact, it is on this day of the creation of the world that God said, let there be light, and there was light. It is also on this day that the Son of Justice has risen for our souls. What's he saying here? The first day of creation was what? Sunday, the creation of light. Therefore, if the light came to the darkness, you follow that? And it also was on Sunday that he rose from the tomb and came from the darkness to the light. All right, so you can see their logic. It's hard to agree with it, but you can kind of see where they were going with all of this. So you have all of these things going on now as the Sabbath was changed. But you come down to around 300 AD. There's no question, at least, where many Christians were going. Not all Christians, but many of them by this time had now separated themselves from the idea of the Sabbath entirely, and they had placed that concept of Sabbath with the Jews. But they had picked up the Jewish understanding of the Sabbath, and now they applied that to Sunday. All right? So, anyway, Eusebius. Now, let me just mention a little bit about both of these men, Eusebius. As I mentioned, one of them was the bishop in Caesarea, one bishop up in Beirut. But or Nicomedia was the term they used back then. The bishop of Nicomedia, the Eusebius of Nicomedia, is the one that baptized Constantine. He also was a distant relative of Constantine, and he was involved in running the empire with Constantine. Not that he was a government official, but he was a counselor. Both of these men, both of these Eusebiuses, both of these Christian bishops were counselors to Constantine. And the Eusebius of Nicomedia, the statement that we had here is the one from Caesarea, but the one from Nicomedia was the one that was really politically astute. And this is kind of intriguing in this whole idea of Constantine and Christianity, in that Constantine, as we mentioned, organized the Council of Nicaea to bring Christianity together. But his two closest Christian advisors, neither one of them were in agreement with most of the other bishops about the divinity of Jesus. Both of them were what we call Arian. There was a man by the name of Arius that taught that Jesus was created. Okay? So both of these Eusebiuses believed that, and Eusebius of Nicomedia had a lot of influence in the household of the emperor. And so the household of the emperor, many of them were Christians, even though Constantine was not. Constantine wasn't a Christian. But many in his household were. Constantine was certainly influenced by Christianity, but he was not a Christian. But many of his household were, but they all were Arian in their belief because they followed these two men that were Arian in their belief. All right? And this led to one of the greatest early controversies in the Christian church. So, Constantine called together this Council of Nicaea. And so now you have these two Christian guys, both of them in opposition to what was voted at the Council of Nicaea. So, the Bishop Eusebius of Nicomedia, as I mentioned, he was a shrewd politician. And it didn't take him long before he got the leading bishops that were in disagreement with him. He got them thrown out of their bishopric. All right? Now, ultimately, Arianism never worked out. But this infighting, at one time, Constantine took this bishop Eusebius of Nicomedia, and he kicked him out of the palace for a while because he got so aggravated with him because Constantine wanted peace. You see, a lot of what motivated Constantine was not religious thinking. A lot that motivated Constantine, probably most of what motivated Constantine, was to try to have good government where there was peace and prosperity. That's what he was after. And it doesn't mean that he did not have some Christian beliefs. It is thought that this bishop of Nicomedia baptized him, and it seems pretty certain that he did, shortly before his death. And so Constantine, it seems, did become a baptized Christian near the time that he died. I have a theory of why Constantine did not become a Christian earlier, and it may not be right, but I guess my guess is as good as anybody else's on it. Since Constantine was so desirous of peace, I think he was never baptized as a Christian simply because he did not want to offend the pagans. He could lean towards Christianity, but once he became a baptized Christian, you see where that would put him. So he just did nothing. Anyway, that's kind of my theory on it. So you had these two guys now that were Christians that were really influential with Constantine. Both of them had a tremendous impact on the thinking of Constantine. All right. 321 AD. Constantine gave this law, the emperor's law. On the venerable day of the sun, and you've heard Adventists repeat that a lot. Right, the venerable day of the sun. That is the holiday of the sun. Let the magistrates and the people residing in the cities rest, and let all workshops be closed. By the way, this is a secular law. There was nothing religious about this law. This is a secular law. In the country, however, persons engaged in agriculture may freely and lawfully continue their pursuits, because it often happens that another day is not so suitable for grain sowing or for vine planting, lest by neglecting the proper moment for such operations, the bounty of heaven rather is to be lost. Anyway, there's Constantine's Sunday law. And many Adventists point to that and they get all excited. Here was this compromise between Christianity and so forth, and Constantine now had this Sunday law. And look, Constantine did this, but no one was persecuted over this. There was religious freedom within the empire. But Constantine was without doubt influenced by both the pagan day of the sun and the Christian acceptance, as we have seen already. Eusebius, a close advisor of his, establishing that Sunday is now the Sabbath with everything that pertains to the Sabbath. And so no doubt those things had an influence on Constantine. And so Constantine now gave this law. Well, that pretty much is who Constantine was and what he did. So let's skip down now to the Council of Laodicea. This is after Constantine. Now here, the church does pass a religious law. The church at this point is not dominating the empire, but the church has a tremendous amount of influence. It says, it is not lawful. By the way, I just put a bunch of things up here. I thought you'd have fun with this. A bunch of things up here from the Council of Laodicea. They had like 60 of these laws that they passed at the Council of Laodicea. And so I just threw some of them up here for fun. We'll come to the Sabbath one in just a moment. It is not lawful to receive unleavened bread from the Jews, nor be partakers of their impiety. Now that does show us, even then, this extreme prejudice against the Jews, right? If you wanted unleavened bread for your communion service, this is an official church council now. They said you cannot take that. You can't go down to the Jewish place and buy it because the Jew made it. All right? It is not lawful to receive unleavened bread from the Jews. It is not lawful to feast together with the heathen or be partakers of their godlessness. So you can't go eat with the heathen. How would Jesus have related to that? You know, as you read down through these things, I wonder why somebody at that council didn't stand up and at the top of their lungs say, hey, has anybody here heard about Jesus? It's only been about 300 years. You know, it's not that long ago. But you see where the Christian church had come at this point. About as far away from Jesus as they could be. Jesus was known as the friend of whom? The sinners, right? In fact, he told the religious leaders of his day, he said, the publicans and the prostitutes are going into the kingdom before you make it. Right?
350 years later, but it sounds like they're adopting the Jewish way of doing things.
Without doubt. You've heard me say before, and you'll hear me say it again, that the Roman Catholicism is just a reenactment of Judaism under a different guise. The devil is extremely clever. All right. Once again, remember Paul, the mystery of iniquity. We spent time on this last week. The mystery of iniquity is already at work within the church. All right. None of the priesthood nor the clergy may go on a journey without the bidding of the bishop. So, if a pastor wanted to go somewhere, he had to get, permission to do so. Women may not go to the altar. They had some pretty tough regulations about women. So, a woman, you don't dare come up front in church. Members of the priesthood and of the clergy must not witness the plays at weddings or banquets. But before the players enter, they must rise and depart. So if they went to a wedding and somebody had a skit, you got to go. You can't be there. It is not permitted to hold love feast, as they are called, in the Lord's houses or churches, nor to eat and spread couches in the house of God. All right. Fellowship lunch, that's out. You're not going to eat in the church. All right? No love feast. What do we often call those today? Of course. Agape. Yeah, a potluck or an agape feast, if we do it something special. Back then, no way, couldn't do that. Christians must not Judaize by resting on the Sabbath. By resting on the Sabbath, but must work on that day rather than honoring the Lord's day. And if they can, resting then as Christians. But if any shall be found to be Judaizers, let them be anathema from Christ. So, if you kept the Sabbath, what does it say? You have no part of Christ if you keep the Sabbath. That's pretty tough stuff. Yeah. But you see how far they had come. You see this drift that had taken place. And now by this counsel, I mean, it's total apostasy against God. It is not right for a deacon to sit in the presence of the pastor. Look at this. Unless he's invited by the pastor to sit down. All right. Likewise, the deacons shall have the worship of the subdeacons and all the inferior clergy. They definitely had developed a caste system within the church. What do you think Jesus would have thought of that? You certainly don't find that in the Gospels, do you? The Psalms, I thought this one was kind of curious. The Psalms are not to be joined together in the congregations, but a lesson shall intervene after every psalm. So if you read a scripture, then you have to have a sermon before you can read another passage. All right, here's some more. It is not permitted to hold. I went the wrong way. Oh well, that was the last one. Anyway, there are a whole bunch more. Some of those are really, really interesting and fun. Huh? Oh yeah. Yeah, just go to the Council of Laodicea. Look at the canons of the Council of Laodicea, and you read all of them. Yeah. I showed you this last week. Some of you weren't able to see it. But this is the God of the sun, and you see the halo that he has around his head. And as I mentioned to you last week, in early Christian artwork, this is Jesus. You see the exact same representations. The God of the sun, they now transferred over into the artwork representing Jesus. We talked a little bit about last week about Santa Claus. I wanted to come back to that. All right. Santa Claus. Let me, how much time do we have here? We don't have much time. All right. Well, let me kind of hasten through this. When we look back at early Christian history, there is no question that there was the blending of paganism and Christianity. It happened simply as a metamorphosis. It was not something that, was immediate. It was something that started in the day of the Apostle Paul, but kind of progressed as time went on. Now, so we end up with the issue of blended Christianity and paganism. So how do we relate to that? I've heard so many things in the Adventist church. Every time there's something somebody doesn't like, it's pagan, and therefore, you got to get rid of it. I've heard that argument about so many different issues. So what about Christmas? Is Christmas a pagan holiday? Sure, absolutely, unquestionably. Is Easter a pagan holiday? Sure, without doubt. Okay. So, we see the elements of paganism, we see the elements of Christianity. So how do we relate to it? Well, it gets related to it in different ways, doesn't it? Ellen White, by the way, had a Christmas tree. Somebody started bad-mouthing Ellen White's Christmas tree, so she took it upstairs and put it in the upstairs of the house. Kept the Christmas tree for the family. But you have this blending of Christianity and paganism. I think when it comes to the issue of Easter and so forth, Christmas, probably for most it's not an issue. And I think we can relate to some degree with Paul and meat offered to idols. Paul said, if your conscience offends you, don't eat the meat that's been offered to idols, right? Because that's a blending of Christian and pagan beliefs. He says, so just don't do it. But he says, it's only food. It makes no difference. It's just food. So eat it. Unless your conscience offends you. And I think that's a good statement, a good approach. Now, with Christmas, I really do not think that people that have Christmas trees or even representations of Santa Claus are worshiping pagan deities. Have you ever heard of anybody that their conscience, they just came away from Christmas and said, oh me, oh my, I worshiped a pagan god this Christmas. I mean, we don't have that issue today, do we? Back then, maybe they did. Today, we don't. I think it's the same thing with Easter. But maybe a more difficult challenge for Adventists have been to relate to issues of Sunday. Is it okay to worship on Sunday? Careful now. Should worship every day. Okay. But if you worship on Sunday, isn't that compromise? You see, there's some Adventists that would tell you that. Now, what's that? Okay. But these are issues that have to be sorted out in our mind, in scripturally as well. But I was just at camp meeting, and I don't mean offense to anyone, but there was one of the seminars at camp meeting, and the individual that made the presentation was a fine person, well-intentioned, but it was about Bible prophecy. And so he was kind of over on this side, you don't do anything on Sunday that looks like worship or, you're compromising. It was that sort of thinking. In fact, the individual went so far as to say, well, if anyone says that they want to do something on Sunday because they want to, reach out to people, that they are wrong to do that. Unless maybe it's giving out literature or something. Well, I thought you might find this interesting. This comes from the writings of Ellen White. Here we go. Brethren may do good work by establishing mission Sunday schools and Sabbath schools. You ever heard that? Brethren may do a good work by establishing mission Sunday schools and Sabbath schools. Schools in which youth may be taught by teachers whose hearts are filled with the love of souls. Why would Ellen White recommend that? Everybody just kind of got really quiet. Why would Ellen White recommend to the Adventist believers that they start Sunday schools? You reach people where you have the opportunity to reach them, right?
That would be a form of outreach, maybe, to her.
Sure. I mean, that's what she's talking about. Reaching people where you can reach them. She's not talking about doing it with the Sabbath. But if people are intentionally, religiously inclined on Sunday, meet them where you can talk with them. All right. Now, there were some Adventists in her day that were, when there were Sunday laws, and they were all concerned that if they observed the Sunday law, that they had now received the mark of the beast. All right? Refraining from work on Sunday is not receiving the mark of the beast. In places where the opposition is so strong as to arouse persecution, if work is done on Sunday, let our brethren make that day an occasion to do genuine missionary work. If they should come here and say, you must close up your work and your presses on Sunday, I would not say to you, keep your presses going, because the conflict does not come between you and God. And there's the issue. If they tell me I can't worship on Sabbath, they've gotten between me and God, right? If they tell me I have to worship on Sunday, have they come between me and God? No, because I'm going to worship God every day of the week, right? That's exactly what Ellen White is saying. She says, we should not feel it enjoined upon us to irritate our neighbors who idolize Sunday by making determined efforts to bring labor on that day before them purposefully to exhibit our independence. Our sisters need not select Sunday as a day to exhibit their washing, hanging out on the clothesline. I remember as a kid, I grew up in North Carolina, and we had some neighbors. I mean, we had a lot of secular neighbors too, but we had some neighbors that, Sunday, they kept Sunday just like we kept Sabbath. When I was a kid growing up, we never mowed our grass on Sunday because we did not want to offend our neighbors. And this is what Ellen White is saying. Now, I know the issues are different today. Nobody cares. But, okay. But let's put some of these things in perspective. She says, to defy Sunday laws will but strengthen in their persecution the religious zealots who are seeking to enforce them. Give them no occasion to call you lawbreakers. Now that's interesting. If there ever is a Sunday law passed, what is Ellen White saying? Don't break it. Right? Isn't that what she's saying? But see, a lot of Adventists want to get in the face and say, I'm standing up against the beast. Hey, if somebody wants you to worship God on Sunday or Monday or Tuesday, praise God and worship God. Right? Yeah, sure. There's a lot of that in the Old Testament. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. Now I have, as Americans, of course, we feel challenged on something like this because we have both what we understand are the spiritual implications of these things, but we also have the political implications. So if there's a religious law passed, what do we automatically want to do? I mean, if there's anything that bugs me is to walk in the stores around here, and I don't understand how they can do this, but they rope off the alcohol. Now, I wish they were roping off green beans. Then I could be rebellious and go in there, right? Say, sell me this. Alcohol, I can't do that. But in any case, it's, they rope it off. You can't buy it Sunday morning. Is that changing? Yeah. Okay. I mean, that is pure and simple a church law. It's because the churches don't want you drinking on Sunday morning. They want to get you into church. I mean, anybody tries to excuse that in any other way, I mean, it makes no sense. All right. But Ellen White's, I think the religious obligation is higher than the political obligation. Right? Okay. All right. Now, Sunday can be used for carrying forward various lines of work that accomplish much for the Lord. Whenever it is possible, I'm going to back up and read that a second time. Whenever it is possible. Can you back up and read it a third time? Whenever it is possible, let religious services be held on Sunday. Now do you feel really uncomfortable? You'll have to ask her. Well, no, please don't do that. All right. Anyway, whenever it is possible, let religious services be held on Sunday. Make these intensely interesting. I've always been intrigued by the fact that Ellen White did not like boring meetings. She didn't like them boring. Make them intensely interesting. She liked things upbeat. Sing genuine revival hymns. What's a revival hymn? It's not that same old church hymn stuff, okay? Here we go, David. A revival hymn, yeah, it's upbeat. That's what she's saying. So here's Ellen White saying, get some life in your music and do it on Sunday, all right? Sing genuine revival hymns and speak with power and assurance of the Savior's love. So she says, hold meetings on Sunday, speak with power and assurance about the Savior's love, and make it exciting and interesting. Now, that's a lot to absorb, isn't it? That's why I read it 3 times. She is recommending doing it. Sure, because she knows that's when you reach people. Right? That's when they will be listening. I mean, for years, our television programs and radio programs, when do we play those? We don't play those on Tuesday night, do we? Sunday morning, yeah. Why? Why has the Voice of Prophecy since its inception, and why has It Is Written since its inception put those programs on Sunday morning? Or reach a people where at a time when they have religious interest. A little difference. This way of spending Sunday is always acceptable to the Lord. Now, that was from Testimonies to the Church, Volume 9, if you want to look it up. But here's another one. I thought you might find this interesting. She writes out to this husband and wife in relationship to making these services exciting. She talks about the music, and she says, let it be simple revival hymns. And then, David, listen to this. This is the next sentence, all right? No, this is not pointed at you. It's just your interest in music. It says, they have had enough of the long, dry hymns in church. All right? To that last one. The first one was Testimonies of the Church, Volume 9. This one was LT 261. So, Ellen White says, she will like things upbeat, but then she's recommending that we have meetings with a simple gospel message that are upbeat and intriguing that will attract people to come and hear. So, Gil? Right. Well, right. As I've mentioned in the past, and even on Sabbath morning, people, even around our church here in our community, are primarily non-Christian people. Now, I think that's hard for us to realize, but the studies look at it and say, no, people in your community, very few of them believe in Christianity. Now, if you ask them, they say, oh, yeah, I'm a Christian. But they don't believe in any of it. So we have a big job in reaching people for Jesus. I had a man, nice guy, call me up. Somebody, some large donor has printed up a gazillion great controversies, and he wanted to know if we wanted to organize handing them out over here. They would furnish them for us. And I told him, I said, look, I said, by all the surveys, the majority, and we're not talking about 50 or 60%, we're talking like 90% of the people in this country cannot tell you one of the simplest Bible stories, and if you told it to them, they wouldn't recognize it. So we live in a society of extreme biblical illiteracy. And to give someone like that a great controversy is not going to compute, because they don't understand even the basics. And I told him, send some over. And I said, I'm sure that church members will know people where it would be effective, and then they can give them out individually. So he's going to give us some great controversies. But just to do that in mass is not the kind of society. It makes us feel good, but it doesn't relate to the people we're trying to reach. That's the reason we see Ellen White. I mean, even back then they had more biblical literacy. But she's saying, give a simple message of the love of Jesus. Win hearts for him. All right. Now, we don't get too concerned. We'll come back to some issues concerning the Sabbath, and so it relates to Bible prophecy, but once again, that's not the issue in Bible prophecy. Issue's always been the same. So, okay, yeah.
It's curious to me that you bring this up because from my early years, I can remember it being pounded in my head. Sunday worshipers, that's going to be the mark of the beast.
I understand. There's coming a Sunday law, and those that go along with the Sunday law are going to receive the mark of the beast. And you notice Ellen White says just the opposite.
If Adventist preachers from the pulpit read that, there'd be a revolution.
Well, yeah, I mean, if there is ever a law passed that you saw what the Council of Laodicea said. What did the Council of Laodicea say? If you worship on the Sabbath, what are we going to do? We're going to kick you out of the church. You're separated from Christ. Now you have an issue, right? So, if you lived back then, what would you say? I'm sorry, kick me out of the church, right? And if there's ever a law, a civil law passed of that nature, what are we going to do? So we'd rather obey God than man. I'm sorry. No? All right. It is 7 minutes after, and I don't know. I'm sorry that we got carried away. Well, we'll come back to some of these things. I don't mean to leave any of these things hanging. We can't do everything in one night, obviously. So, all right. Are we still on track? You okay with all of this? All right. Sorry to keep you over time. And Glenn, I'm going to call on you again, if you would, please.
Dear Heavenly Father, we thank Thee for all that You have done for us. Lord, we pray that You would continue to open our minds to what is truth and help us to think everything we do to glorify You and to be glory. Lord, we pray that You be with those that are on our sick list and those that have many. And pray that You be with those that are grieving, especially pray for the Shook family. Pray that You would bless the pastor's words tonight, that You would be with the Sabbath, Brother White. Be with us as we travel home tonight. For us these things in Jesus' precious name.
Amen. All right. Thank you for being here tonight. Have a good evening. See you Sabbath. Those of you online, thanks for being with us.